The shutter, as we know, is a curtain that opens and closes. It's all it does. Make sure I don't have any film in here. Okay. The shutter is that curtain in the back of the camera, opens and closes. I know it's kind of tough doing the share and doing the slide. All right, so the shutter opens, lets light in, light passes through the camera, strikes the film, and then the shutter closes. That's what it does. It's either all the way open, all the way closed. Boy, howdy. Oh, look, you can see the animation. This is awesome. Okay. So you click the shutter release, mirror goes up, shutter curtain opens, secondary shutter closes, mirror goes back down. That's how the shutter operates. Excuse me. Okay. It's pretty straightforward. When we're talking about shutter, the key descriptor for this is what's referred to as shutter speed. And shutter speed actually, it refers to the length of time that the shutter is open. So shutter time is probably a better descriptor, but it's not the one we use. The nomenclature is shutter speed. So the long end of shutter speed is 1 second, and that's what that shutter was set on when I just played around with it before. I had the shutter speed set on 1 for 1 second. Shutter opens, shutter closes. You can actually see with the lens right now, you can see the light coming through. Shutter opens, shutter closes. That's 1 second. And on the opposite end of the scale is 1/1000th of a second. You might, if I get this position correctly, yeah, you might be able to see a flash of light, but 1/1000th of a second is really quicker than our eye can acknowledge. So that shutter did open and close. 1 second is a long exposure. 1/1000th of a second is a short exposure. Okay. We control the shutter speed in one of two ways. Either on the old manual camera, there's a dial on the top of the camera, and you turn that dial and you set the shutter speed, and there's a little hash mark that an indicator, so you know where your shutter speed is set. Shutter speed on this particular camera at the moment is set at 1/30th of a second. Camera on the right is a more modern electronic camera. It has almost every button or dial on this camera has multiple uses, multiple purpose. This scroll wheel that you see by the red arrow is it's called the control dial. All right, that's what it's called. And it's set in most cases, and you can physically set this yourself with this camera, so that when you scroll the wheel, it changes the shutter speed. And then there's another button, secondary button you can push, and you push that button and turn the scroll wheel, and it will operate the aperture. So rather than having a place to go, a knob, a dial to turn for shutter speed, like in the camera on the left, camera on the right, that scroll wheel is going to do a couple different things. Long shutter speeds, 1 second through 1/130th of a second, create a perception of motion through blur. All right, so the shutter's open, things are traveling, and they leave a trace across the film. Boy, howdy. At the other end, a fast shutter speed, 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th of a second. They will create a perception of stopped motion. We can give the perception of stopped motion, stopping time. We can give the perception of time passing in front of us. It's a really powerful metaphorical perception we can create with our cameras. That's why we have to know how they work. So, all right, so that's what shutter speed does. It affects how much light hits the film. But it controls our perception of motion, how we perceive the motion that's being portrayed in the scene. Okay. The second part of this is the aperture. So the aperture is that set of curved blades that's located inside the lens. All right, so that set of blades that's inside the lens, that it might be wide or closed down. All right, it's like the iris in your eye. It never closes completely, but it controls the intensity of the light. All right, so if there's not a lot of intensity, it's evening, it's dark, you're outside, and there's no light, you're inside in a dark room, the aperture will open up to allow more intensity, more light to pass through, or it will close down if the light outside is really intense and you need to control the intensity that way. All right, so that's that aperture. It's that set of curved blades. And there it be. Now with shutter speed, the nomenclature for shutter speed is pretty easy to understand. It's fractions of a second, from 1 second, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, all the way up through 1/1000th of a second. Aperture numbers are different. Now, aperture numbers are referred to as f-stops. And the f-stop numbers aren't as fluid and poetic as shutter speed numbers, because they're the result of a formula, mathematical formula that has division in it and stuff that is not my friend. So the largest aperture has the smallest number, and the smallest aperture has the largest number. So f1.8 is a very large opening. f2.8 is half the size of the 1.8. f4 is half the size of 2.8. f5.6 is half the size of f4. And on most lenses will run through f22. On the other end, depending on the lens type, this single purpose lens, 50 millimeter lens for this Nikon camera, the maximum aperture on this is 1.8, and actually says it on the lens, says 1.8. On a lot of like kit lenses or zoom lenses that you will get for like the Canon or that Minolta Maxim, if you look on the front of that lens on your Maxim, your maximum aperture, your largest aperture is probably somewhere in between f2.8 and f4, probably f3.5. That's pretty common. Nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't have, because of the way the lens is constructed, it just, that aperture just doesn't get as large. The control for the aperture is either going to be on the lens itself, like in the case of this particular lens, the ring right here, the aperture control ring, or on an electronic camera, that control wheel, or this is how the whole thing works together. This is shutter speed, aperture are these two independent parts of the camera. Understanding exposure is where the synthesis happens. All right, something's going on. You guys can still hear me okay? Okay, I'm getting these notifications on my screen that everything's changing on me. Okay. So when we talk about exposure, we're talking about a measurement of the total amount of light that's striking the film. And we have to be able to control how much light is hitting the film. Too much is no good, not enough is no good. The difference between, too much and too little is just a small amount here. All right. So the shutter's controlled. One more. The shutter's controlled, or exposure's controlled by shutter speed and aperture. And that we established through this excruciating first hour. All right. Exposure is a constant. Exposure is always the same. We always.
Can you go back to that?
Yeah.
Where it said exposure is controlled by shutter something?
Shutter and aperture.
Okay. Speed.
Shutter speed and aperture, right. What an aperture. So what puts the ape in aperture? Courage.
Okay.
Okay, just.
All right.
Okay. So exposure is a constant. It doesn't matter if you're working outside in bright light. It doesn't matter if you're working indoors in a dimly lit room. You still need the same amount of exposure all the time on your film. If the proper exposure was to fill this cup with water, it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're outside. It doesn't matter. It's just if it doesn't matter if the water's coming from a waterfall, from a hose, or if it's just fog and you're trying to collect it. It's still the same amount of exposure all the time. And so you have to control your shutter speed and your aperture to allow the proper amount of exposure on your film. Shutter speed controls the time, the length of time that you expose. You can expose for 1 second, 1/2 a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 up to 1/1000th of a second. Every time you go to a faster shutter speed, you reduce your exposure by half. If you go from a fast shutter speed to a slow, every time you change the shutter speed, you increase your exposure by a factor of 2. It's either double or half every time you change. So that's a lot every time you change that shutter speed. Aperture determines the intensity. All right. So if you have a really small aperture, you have a really small intensity. All right. You open that up, you're allowing a lot more light through at one time. Little bit of light comes through, a lot of light comes through every time you change that aperture. Okay. Shutter speed determines the length of time of the exposure. Aperture determines the intensity of the exposure. Exposure is a constant. It's a combination of the length of time that light is allowed to hit the film and the intensity of the light while it's hitting the film. So if I need to fill this cup with water and it's raining outside, it's raining really hard, and I stick the cup out through the door, rain fills it up in a couple of seconds. All right. The constant is the fullness. I need the full glass of water. That's my exposure level. So if I have a lot of intensity, the water is really hard, I don't need much time. Now, if I go out there and it's just drizzling, and I put this out here, that drizzle, maybe it takes 5 minutes to fill. Instead of 5 seconds, it takes 5 minutes to fill this cup. The level of the water in the cup, that's the constant. It always has to be the same. The intensity, the intensity of the water determines the length of time that you have to expose that cup to the water in order to get that exposure. So does that make sense? What we're talking about, the balance between intensity and time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me ruin it for you then. Okay, shutter speed is time. Aperture is intensity. Oh, thank you. Okay, I left the door open and the whole family's got to listen to me teach.
Oh, we love listening.
No, they love listening to me teach. Okay. So they say out loud. Okay. So every time you press the shutter release, you open the shutter and the aperture steps down. When the lens is on your camera, it will always be open to its fullest. And then when you click the shutter and that mirror flips up out of the way and the shutter opens, the lens will go boop and it'll drop down to that size. And then as soon as the shutter closes, it'll open back up. And the reason it does that is that if it was closed, you couldn't see through it. The world would be really, really dark looking through that tiny little hole. So the lens stays at its large value, its large aperture value, until the instant you press the shutter release. Then it stops down and then it reopens. So if you try that with your camera and you turn the camera around so you're looking into the lens and set the aperture at f/22, when you click the shutter, you'll see it go boop, close, and then open back up. Just saying. All right, so every time you press the shutter release, you open the shutter, the aperture stops down to its working size. The length of time the shutter is open and the size of the aperture work together to allow a precise amount of light to pass through to expose the film. That was a single sentence. That was awesome. The length of time the shutter is open and the size of the aperture work together to allow a precise amount of light to pass through the camera to expose the film.
So if that's like how film, is that how like digital works
Same
too?
thing. Yeah, right. Except instead of film, there's a digital sensor in the back.
So like, how does I'm confused.
That's okay. That's my job.
I'm just like, because I'm a photographer, so like I have a really nice camera and I'm still like learning it.
Yeah.
But like, I don't understand how it actually works, and that's like why I'm taking this class. But yeah.
No, I'm laughing because I don't know how it works either. I just know that it does.
I just know how to take really nice pictures somehow.
Yeah. Now, so when you can see me, right? You can see what I'm like when I'm holding the camera up. So,
Yes.
all right. So, on this camera, I open up the back and the film goes in the back. On a digital camera, there isn't, you don't open the back because back here is the sensor. So this back, obviously this back doesn't open. So let me find, where's my, all right, I think I can show you on, so on this camera, because this camera doesn't have a mirror. And I don't know, yeah, so can't get it. All right, do you see the green? That's the
Yeah.
sensor, all right? So right now on this camera, the shutter is open. And that's the actual, instead of film, there's the sensor. So that's what's built into this camera instead of film is this digital sensor. So, but it's the same, it's exactly the same thing. Okay, so the length of time the shutter is open, the size of the aperture work together to allow precise amount of light, not kitty, to pass. Oh, see my kitty wants to say hello, not to. All right. So when you alter one of these things, it alters the other one. So if and I'm filling my cup with water, if I change the intensity of the flow into the cup, it changes the time. And if I change the time, then I have to change the intensity. So let's try this then. So let's say my constant, I'm traveling in a car. My constant is 100 miles. I have to travel 100 miles. My journey is 100 miles. It can't be more, it can't be less. It's got to be that length. If I travel that distance at 100 miles per hour, how long is that trip going to take? 100 miles at 100 miles an hour. How long is that going to take? It's going to take 1 hour, correct? All right, I can get the whiteboard up and we can do the math. Okay. But if I travel that 100 miles going 10 miles an hour, how long is that trip going to take?
Can you repeat what you just said? I didn't hear it.
What's that?
What did you say? I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, I didn't hear what I said. If I'm traveling 100 miles, that's my constant is that 100 miles, but I travel it at 10 miles per hour, how long is that going to take?
An hour.
10 hours, right? 10 miles per hour for 10 hours is 100 miles. 100 miles per hour at 1 hour, and for 1 hour is 100 miles. So that 100 miles is the exposure. The 100 miles per hour is my aperture. It's the intensity, right? And then the 1 hour is my shutter speed. It's the length of time. So if I have a lot of intensity, 100 miles per hour, I use a short time, 1 hour to get my 100 miles. If I reduce the intensity from 100 to 10, then instead of taking 1 hour, it takes 10 hours. The result is the same either way. It's still 100 miles. That constant is the same. That's what the aperture and the shutter speed are all about. That's what that balance is all about with shutter speed and aperture. Sometimes you run into a problem though, that you can't turn your aperture as far as you want it to go, or you can't turn your shutter speed. And let's say then, so I get stuck where I can only go 65 miles an hour. I'd like to go 100, but I can't go any higher than 65 because that's the speed limit. And I don't, break the law. So it's going to take me 1.53 hours or something like that. So it's a little bit. So there's always this balance you have to achieve in order to keep that constant, and that's I guess if nothing else, what I want to get across to you about exposure is that exposure is constant. It's always the same. So if they're reciprocal. So if your shutter speed gets longer, you have to reduce the intensity. Intensity's got to be less. If you open that aperture and you create more intensity, your shutter speed is going to be shorter to keep that balance. Okay. So filling water from a faucet. Okay. Length of time. That was weird. That went fast. Shutter speed is time. Aperture is intensity. Let's fill the water again. Wow, that was fun. Okay. Length of time of the flow, intensity of the flow. Length of time of the travel, intensity of the travel. All right. Does that make sense? Does it make enough sense? Okay. Whether or not it makes sense, will you say, yes, it makes sense so that we can move on? Okay, good answer. All right, so if one thing changes, one variable increases, the other one's got to decrease. So if your length of time increases, your intensity has to decrease. If your intensity increases, your time has to decrease to keep that balance. That's all. It's a scale, it's a balance. Oh, look, I even said it's all about achieving balance. It's like life, right? In through the nose, out through the mouth. Just keep that balance. Okay. I'm kind of rushing through this, and I don't want to necessarily. So, because we've got 20 minutes here. So, because I want this to make sense. And there are examples later in this slideshow, but your camera has all the information. It has a meter. It has a device built into it so that you can tell where your exposure is. So you're always looking for that zero on the exposure. That's the constant. That's where you want to be. Now, if you go one way and you'll overexpose. You go the other way, you'll underexpose. You want to try to keep it in near that zero. All right, if you go over a little, you go under a little. You go one stop over, one stop under. It's not great, but it's not going to ruin anything. It's like, you're going 65, you got a 65-mile-an-hour speed limit. You're going 70, 72, you're okay. You're going 75, 78. You might get lucky, you might not.
What if it's dark? So whenever I feel like it's dark, I'll kind of like raise the exposure on my camera.
Okay. The thing is, even if it's dark, it doesn't matter. You still have to be at that zero. So and you do that by, at this point, you're probably going to have, if it's dark, you're going to have your aperture open as large as you can get it. And you might be using a shutter speed of half a second or 1 second or 2 seconds or 4 seconds if it's really dark. It's going to take, because if I'm filling this cup, it doesn't matter what time of day. It doesn't matter if it's dark. I still have to get that. I still have to get it full. So if all I have is the fog, it might take a long time to fill this glass with fog. All right. So it's a constant. I mean, and a constant is a constant. You always have to get enough light to get that correct exposure. If you don't get enough light, you won't have an image on your film. Your film will just look blank. You won't see an image at all. It's not a perfect answer, but
So that's for like film, not for like digital though.
same thing. No. Did say same thing. Same thing for digital. Film and digital work the same. They're two different versions because the film and the sensor in your camera do the same thing. They collect light. The only difference between the two is that you put the film in your camera, and your ISO is 400 and it doesn't change. On a digital camera, you can change that. It's like taking the film out and putting a higher speed film in. So you can fake it with a digital camera. Let me circle around to that one. Let me come back to that one. Okay. So let's try to make an example of this. So top row here is all my apertures. F2 is the largest aperture. It's lets in more light. It allows more exposure. It allows more intensity. As we go across the scale, as the apertures get smaller, we have less intensity. All right, it's also allowing less light, creating less exposure. It's the same thing for the shutter. If you look at the shutter speeds, the way this is set up, 1 second is more light and it's more exposure. And that's because we're allowing more time. As you go down the scale towards the fast shutter speeds, faster shutter speed is less time. So it's allowing less light to come through, creating less exposure. So somewhere in there is a balance between those top and the bottom. And it depends on a number of things, like how much light you're working. If I'm outside during the day, I'm working with a really bright, intense light, my settings are going to be different than they are if I'm working inside in the dark. So let's try a for instance here. This is gonna be fun. Let's just say that I'm standing outside taking some photographs. It's a kind of an overcast day. It's not real bright. And my meter is telling me that if I set my shutter speed at 60 and I set my aperture at 5.6, that I'm going to be right at 0 on that scale. It's the perfect amount of light. Not too little, not too much. It's just the perfect amount of light. Okay, I can take the photograph and I'll be good. However, let's say I'm photographing, sporting event, and I want to try to freeze motion. Remember, we talked about in one of our lectures that like between like 15, 30, 60, 125, those shutter speeds, they're not really good at freezing motion. They're not particularly good at blurring motion. You have to really get towards the edges to get the real frozen motion or the real blurred motion. So I'm going for the real frozen motion. All right, it's a football game. I want to get pictures of people catching the ball. And so instead of 60th of a second, I decide that I want to use 1/500th of a second. So I turn my shutter speed from 60, go click to 125, click to 250, click to 500. How many times have I moved that shutter speed? Shout it out. 3. Okay. How did that affect my exposure when I changed that? Go ahead, someone shout it out loud. How did that, when I changed that shutter speed, how did that change the exposure? What did it do to the exposure?
There's going to be less light.
Okay, why?
Because there's not as much time for the light to pass through.
Right, because because my shutter speed is shorter. Right. How much less light? Well, okay, I'll answer that for you because I'm not really asking it. So I'll go from 60 to 125, I'm allowing half as much light. Go from 125 to 250, I'm allowing half as much again. And if I go from 250 to 500, I'm allowing half as much again. So instead of being at 0, I'm 1 stop underexposed, 2 stops underexposed, 3 stops underexposed. I'm way off. So if I take that picture, I'm going to have not nearly enough light entering the camera, and so I'm going to have a real thin piece of film without a very good photograph of. So if I am reducing the time and reducing the exposure, how do I fix that balance? How do I reestablish the balance with my aperture?
You would go to a larger.
Okay. Yes, that's a correct answer. So if I'm using less time, I need more intensity. So where do I want to end up? If I'm at 5.6 and I lost 1, 2, 3 shutter speeds here, where do I go on the aperture? Where am I going to end up on the aperture to reestablish that balance?
Would that be F11? Or do
Well,
you
if,
go the opposite way?
okay, well, I want you to tell me. So look at the shutter speeds first. We went from 60 to 125 to 250 to 500. That's less light, less exposure.
Okay,
Look at the aperture. Where is more light and more exposure?
going towards the F2,
Okay, so
F2.8.
right. So I moved my shutter speed 3 positions. Where do I go with my aperture?
You'd go to F2 because that would be
1,
3.
2, 3. Look at that.
Okay,
Does that make sense at all? So I my it's like, okay, it's like the miles per hour and the time. My constant is that X amount of light. Now 60 and 5/6 creates a balance. If I move that shutter speed, I can create my balance. And what happens is that combination 500 at f2 lets in exactly as much light as 60 and 5/6.
so as many times as you go one way, the opposite will be that many times going the opposite way.
Ding, 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 ding,
Okay.
ding. Hold your calls. We have a winner.
Only because it
Yeah.
makes more sense with you showing the illustration. As for, if this wasn't here, I wouldn't understand anything that you're just saying.
If this wasn't here, I wouldn't understand any of it either. Yeah. This is the hardest thing we are going to learn this semester. What we're doing right now, what you're looking at right now. And if it doesn't make sense tonight, don't worry about it. We are going to review this until you know it, or you beg of me to stop. So that's the thing, that f5/6 is the same amount of light. 60 at 5/6 is the same amount of light, same amount of exposure as 500 and f2. And I think that's magical, because what that is telling you is that, you know, the first thing you want to do is just you put the camera up and you make sure that your meter's in the middle. And then once that's in the middle, then you decide what combination is going to work. If you wanted to blur, if we go back, I'm going to go back, let's go back and clear that out. Okay, so if we were at 60 and 5/6, let's say I wanted to go let's say I wanted to shoot a landscape photograph. And I wanted my aperture as small as I could get it, so I had a better depth of field. What's the smallest aperture on this list?
F22.
Right, just look at the dots, right? F22. All right, how many positions over is that F22 from 5.6?
4.
4. So that's less intensity 4 times. Where does my shutter speed go to balance it out?
So 4 times over then.
Right.
It would go to F2.
Well, the 60, the shutter speed on the bottom, where's it go? 4 over from 4
Oh.
times longer shutter speed from 60.
It would go to 4.
Yeah.
Because you went 4 times over one way.
So
Okay.
60 at f5.6 is the same amount of light as a quarter of a second at f22, same amount of light as 500th of a second at f2. It's traveling 100 miles at 100 miles an hour, traveling 100 miles at 10 miles an hour, traveling 100 miles at 65 miles an hour. The 100 miles is the constant. The 100 miles is the amount of exposure. The variables between the speed, the time and the intensity. It's just, it's your oyster to open. Wow. Bang. Okay. Yeah, that one hurts. All right. So let's just go through this again. You know how long it took me to make this animation? A lot longer than it takes to play it. Okay. I spent like 4 hours putting this slideshow together. Actually, when I built this slideshow, I think, honest to God, it took me almost 10 hours to put this one together. Okay. Excuse me, here's why. So here's why that stuff is important. All right, we're gonna wrap up real fast here. So if I have a neutral exposure, the correct amount of light, we'll call it neutral. It's just right in the middle. That's what a good negative is going to look like. You see how you can see some really, really rich, thick black. Since it's a negative, black is indicating white stuff in your photograph, and the light gray or clear is indicating black stuff in your photograph because it's a negative. Just like the light gets recorded in our eye as a negative, so we see the world opposite that way too. When we make our print, if we have a good negative, we get a beautiful print. If we accidentally underexpose our film, the negative looks really great, because if we underexpose, we don't get enough light, we don't get that really rich, thick black on the negative. And so when we go to make a print, you get the clear part of the film will still produce the black, but you don't have that thickness, so you don't get the white. So if you have an underexposed negative, you get this really gray, sooty, just blah image. And that's probably about 2 stops underexposed. 1 stop, you'd be okay. So, but if we overexpose the film, then the stuff that's not supposed to be thick and black gets black. And what happens then is you've got this image that you can't print it long enough to get the blacks, and it just looks burnt out. So that's the reason why we're always chasing this correct exposure. All right, I'm going to skip this because for some reason I thought this was important. It's very cool, but
It's a roof.
it's that is the roof at, let me go okay, and sorry, now I got to go through this all again, at Point Gratiot Lighthouse in Dunkirk. So that's the roof of the house from the lighthouse tower. Okay, good negative makes a nice print. Crappy negative makes either a really weak print or just a completely blown out print. All right, we're wrapping up fast here. All of this stuff, this is available as a self-running PDF. And I think you can probably just print it out. There's a movie and a PDF version. so you can print all this junk out. Okay. Different kinds of camera meters. Your camera's going to have one of these. Upper left-hand corner is like a Pentax camera, is literally a stick that moves up and down. And you want that stick in the neutral position. That's that constant. You want that stick always in the middle. The one on the right, some Nikon, some old Canons. The one stick would move up and down, and you have to move all your junk around until the one with the circle lines up. So you got the one, and then you got to line the other one up by changing your shutter speed and aperture. And it's frustrating until you figure it out. The meter on the lower right, I think the Canon Rebels have this. Some of the Minoltas, Pentax have this. It's a green light, right? Green or red. Green means go. The green light lights up, you take the picture. The red light is lit, then you either have too much light or too little light. And then the one on the lower right, you'll find on like Canons and Nikons, just a sliding scale, 0, overexposed, underexposed. Okay. I'm just going to run through here. This meter also, it shows you your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO of your film. But you can see it tells you if you're 1 stop under, 2 stops under, 1. And that's actually right in the viewfinder. So when you're looking through your camera, that information is right there. Okay. So if you're within 1 over, 1 under, you're good to go. Okay. In conclusion, let's see what our conclusion is. In conclusion, exposure is a constant, shutter and aperture are reciprocals, change in one causes an equal and opposite change in the other. It's like the scarecrow. Wow. Learn your camera. Understand, okay, yes. Learn your camera, understand what your meter is telling you. The meter is telling you of too much light, not enough light, just enough light. You have to know what your camera, what the information your camera is giving you.